Dry Creek was the kind of place where the wind spoke louder than men, and the land was too hard for kindness to take root. The sun hung over the plains like a merciless overseer, beating down on the brittle earth and weathered timbers of crooked buildings. Dust clung to every surface and filled the air so thick that it coated tongues and throats, leaving a permanent grit between teeth. Men spat, women kept their eyes down, and no one asked questions about what happened behind closed doors. In 1884, law came from a gun. God spoke through firebrand sermons, and a woman's worth was bound up in who claimed her. The preacher's voice cut through the stillness like a lash. From the crude wooden church at the heart of town, Ezra Pike's sermon spilled out into the street, fire and brimstone wrapped in righteous fury. He was a tall, sharp-featured man with a voice like gravel and a gaze that could turn water to stone. Folks claimed he was chosen, anointed by the Lord himself, to cleanse the wicked from Dry Creek. And none were more wicked, he claimed, than a girl who let herself swell with child without a man's name to shield her. Clara Avery sat alone at the back of the congregation, her bonnet hiding most of her pale, dust-smudged face. 19 years old, and already the world had closed its doors on her. Her father's ranch had long since gone to ruin after a bout of fever took him and left her alone to tend the last of the cattle. It was in those lonely months that a man named Caleb Morrow rode through, a traveling merchant with a quick grin and a flask of Southern whiskey. He spoke of California dreams and sweet fortunes out west, and for a while Clara believed him. But men like Caleb never stayed long. He left with the dawn and the last of her innocence, and weeks later, when Clara's belly betrayed her, Dry Creek turned its back with a speed and cruelty that stole the breath from her lungs. Now she sat, stomach barely showing under the folds of her simple cotton dress, but it was enough. Whispers rippled through the town like a sickness. Old women clucked their tongues. Storekeepers refused to sell her bread. Children were yanked away by their mothers if they passed too close. In Dry Creek, a girl without a husband was a walking curse, a sign of God's displeasure. Ezra Pike stood at the pulpit, arms outstretched, voice rising in a fever pitch. "The wages of sin," he thundered, "is death, and the Lord in his mercy has given us charge to cleanse our flock of the rot that festers within it." His eyes locked on Clara like a hawk sighting a hare, a Jezebel among us, defiling his sacred land. The townsfolk murmured their agreement, nodding like cattle in a pen, and behind them, in the shadowed corner of the church, a figure lingered unnoticed. An old man, lean as a fence rail, face seamed with old scars, hat pulled low over cold, watchful eyes. Jonas Cutter. Most folks didn't know his name anymore, and those who did kept it buried deep under whiskey and forgetfulness. Clara stood, blood pounding in her ears, and bolted from the church before the preacher's words finished falling. The wooden door slammed behind her, and she gulped the hot, dusty air like a drowning woman. The street was near empty in the heat of midday. A stray dog slunk by, ribs sharp against its hide. From the saloon porch, a cluster of men watched her with the cold detachment of men who'd already decided a thing's fate. Among them was Macklin Crow, a name whispered in Dry Creek the way children spoke of bogeymen. Tall, with a shock of pale hair and eyes the color of dirty snow, Macklin ruled the town's outlaws with a fistful of gunmetal and a taste for cruelty. He leaned back in his chair, one boot propped on a rail, watching Clara with the air of a man observing a bug crawling toward a flame. Next to him, his men chuckled, the laughter carrying a dark promise. "She won't last a day in the Badlands," one muttered. "Won't need to," Macklin drawled. "Coyotes'll have her by nightfall." Clara felt their eyes on her like 1,000 needles. She hurried down the main street, past the dry goods store, past the smithy where the blacksmith deliberately turned his back. No one spoke to her. No one lifted a hand. At the far end of town sat her father's old ranch house, a sagging relic, surrounded by brittle scrub and empty paddocks. The place felt hollow now, the air inside thick with memory. She gathered what little she could, a water skin, a blanket, a knife that had once belonged to her father. The sky was already bleeding into orange as the sun tipped low. There was no plan, no clear path. East led to the river, but no town within 50 miles. West, the open plains, where dust storms and thirst would finish what Dry Creek had started. South, the Badlands, a twisted maze of red rock canyons, where men vanished and legends grew like weeds. A knock sounded at the door. Sharp, measured. Clara's breath caught. She clutched the knife and crept to the window. Outside stood Jonas Cutter. She didn't know his name then, only that he was a stranger, older than most, with a face made of old leather and eyes that missed nothing. "Girl," he said without raising his voice, though it carried like a bell. "You ain't safe here." Her fingers tightened on the knife. "Ain't safe nowhere." Jonas looked past her, toward the rise of the church steeple, then back. "Not tonight. Not alone." Clara shook her head. "Ain't your concern." For a moment, something flickered behind those cold eyes. A memory. A scar not on the skin, but somewhere deeper. "Best you run," he said at last, voice low. "West'll kill you slow. East won't take you. Badlands might be your only chance." "Why do you care?" He didn't answer, just tipped his hat and turned away, fading into the dusk like a ghost. Night came fast in Dry Creek. As the last light bled from the sky, torches lit along the main street. Men gathered. Guns gleamed in the firelight. At the head of them stood Macklin Crow and Preacher Pike, grim as twin reapers. The air smelled of dry wood and hate. "She won't run far," Pike declared. "And when we find her, justice will be done." Macklin grinned, teeth sharp in the firelight. "Don't much care about justice. Just want to watch her crawl." They moved as one, a dark tide sweeping toward the ranch. From a bluff overlooking the town, Jonas Cutter watched them go. He leaned against an old juniper, a long rifle resting across one arm. The desert wind pulled at his coat, and the old scars across his throat and cheek ached in the cooling air. He spat once into the dust. Dry Creek hadn't changed. Wouldn't. Not without fire. He watched the flickering torches snake toward the ranch, and then he slipped into the shadows, moving silent as a hunting cat. If this was to be Clara Avery's end, it wouldn't come easy for the men chasing her. Not while Jonas Cutter drew breath. The night air hung heavy, thick with the scent of storm clouds and scorched earth. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, a low, angry growl that seemed to echo the hearts of men gathered in Dry Creek Square. Torches burned high, their orange glow clawing against the black sky, throwing wild shadows over faces twisted by hate and fevered righteousness. Clara Avery's bare feet scraped against the hard-packed dirt as they dragged her through the street. Her wrists were bound in coarse rope, the fibers biting into skin rubbed raw. Dust clung to her hair and cheeks, and her dress, once pale blue, hung in tatters, streaked with grime and blood from where they'd knocked her down. Every step jarred her, sending aches through her ribs where boot heels had landed earlier. Yet her chin stayed high. The townsfolk lined the street, packed close and silent save for the occasional muttered curse or spit into the dirt. Men who'd once tipped their hats in passing. Women who'd once bought milk from her hands. Now their eyes held nothing but contempt, as though Clara were some sickness that had seeped into their bones. She could see Macklin Crow waiting by the gallows pole, a noose lazily dangling from one side, though it wasn't meant for her tonight. Not yet. He leaned against a post, pale hair gleaming like bone in the firelight, a look of cruel amusement etched across his face. Preacher Pike stood atop a crude platform beside him, one bony hand wrapped tight around a leather-bound Bible, the other raised toward the sky. His voice sliced through the night air as Clara was hauled before him. "Behold," Pike thundered, "the wages of sin made flesh, a harlot without a husband, carrying a child born of wickedness and deceit. This town will not suffer such corruption to spread among our flock." A chorus of shouted agreement rose from the crowd. Torches lifted higher. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters of nearby buildings, tossing grit into the faces of the gathered mob. Clara's knees gave as they shoved her to the ground before the preacher's feet. She forced herself upright, lips cracked and bleeding, but her gaze steady. "Go on then," she rasped. "Do what you came for." There was a flicker in Pike's eyes, whether surprise or satisfaction. She couldn't tell. He lifted the Bible, gesturing to the horizon where the jagged silhouettes of the Badlands rose like the teeth of some waiting beast. "For her sins," he declared, "this girl shall be cast out beyond the grace of God and the reach of decent folk, into the Badlands, where beasts and demons shall have her, and the Lord's justice shall be made complete." Macklin stepped forward, fingering the knife at his belt. "Won't take long out there," he said with a slow, mocking grin. "Coyotes'll have their fill before dawn. Be doing the town a kindness, really." A few men laughed. A couple of women turned their faces away. Clara straightened, spitting blood into the dirt. "Better coyotes than your kind," she said, voice low but carrying. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the darkness beyond the reach of torchlight, a voice spoke. "I'll take her." Heads turned, a ripple of unease passing through the crowd. From the gloom stepped a figure, tall and lean, a battered wide-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow. A long coat hung to his knees, dust-streaked and worn thin at the cuffs. A rifle rested easy across one shoulder, its barrel catching the fire's glow. Jonas Cutter's face emerged from beneath the brim, lined, weathered, marked with old scars like half-forgotten war maps. Eyes the color of worn steel met Macklin's without blinking. "I'll take the girl," he said again, voice like dry earth cracking under boot heel. For a long moment, no one spoke. Macklin's grin faltered, replaced by something colder. "You some kind of fool, old man. This town's business don't concern you." Jonas took a step closer, and though his hand stayed easy at his sides, every man there could feel the weight of him, not in his size, but in the unspoken violence that clung to him like a shadow, the kind of presence a man carried after seeing too many die up close. "Reckon it does," Jonas replied. "Ain't no justice here tonight. Just a pack of dogs looking for blood. I'll take her, and I'll see her out of this place. None of you'll have to soil your hands further." Preacher Pike bristled, raising his Bible again. "You defy the will of God, stranger. This town is his house. His law is clear." Jonas turned his gaze to Pike, the corner of his mouth curling into something like pity. "I've known God's law, preacher, and this ain't it." The wind howled, lifting dust and twisting, ghostly spirals between them. Thunder grumbled again, closer now. Macklin's hand hovered near the grip of his revolver. His men tensed, shifting their weight, eyes flicking between Jonas and their leader. Clara, still kneeling, felt a cold knot in her chest begin to loosen. She didn't know this man, but something in his voice, in the way not a tremor touched his hands, spoke of someone who'd stood alone before and survived. "I ought to shoot you where you stand," Macklin said softly. Jonas smiled, and it wasn't a kind thing. "Reckon you should." They stood like that, the world holding its breath. Then Pike broke the silence. "Let him have her," he spat. "If the fool wants to drag a cursed soul into damnation alongside him, so be it. The Lord's judgment finds all men in time." Macklin hesitated, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered behind those ice-pale eyes. Then he stepped back, gesturing to his men. "Cut her loose." A rough hand sliced through the rope at Clara's wrists. She staggered, nearly falling, until Jonas reached out and steadied her with a hand on her elbow. His grip was firm, sure. "Come on," he murmured. Clara's throat burned, but she nodded. As they moved toward the edge of the square, Macklin called after them. "You'll regret this, old man. Badlands ain't kind to runts and relics." Jonas didn't turn. "Kind enough," he said, and led Clara into the night. Behind them, the mob began to disperse, muttering like a storm rolling off. Thunder cracked overhead, and the first fat drops of rain splattered the dust, hissing in the torch flames. Clara glanced at Jonas as they walked, his face set and unreadable. "Why?" she asked hoarsely. He didn't answer right away, just kept his eyes ahead, on the darkness swallowing the road beyond town. "Because someone should," he said at last. And the rain came down, washing the blood and dust from the earth, though not from memory. The Badlands swallowed them before dawn. Red rock canyons rose on either side like ancient, jagged teeth, their faces streaked with the memory of countless storms and long-dead rivers. The air was brittle and sharp, and every step crunched against stone and bone-dry sand. The desert held its own kind of silence, not emptiness, but a patient, watching stillness, as though the land itself waited to see which of them would fall first. Clara stumbled more than once, her strength frayed by exhaustion and hunger, but Jonas never hurried her. He moved through the rough country like a man born to it, one hand steady on the stock of his rifle, eyes always sweeping the ridges and crevices. When the sun crested the horizon, it turned the stone around them into bands of crimson and gold, and even in her weariness, Clara felt a flicker of awe. "Where are we going?" she managed, her throat raw from dust. "Somewhere they won't think to look," Jonas answered without glancing back. They moved in silence for hours. At one point, Jonas pointed to a cluster of scrub where a desert hare crouched, trembling. He lifted his rifle, fired once, and by nightfall, they sat beside a low, flickering fire in the hollow of a narrow canyon, smoke curling up toward a sky smeared with violet and bruised blue. The meat was tough, but Clara hadn't tasted food in days, and it might as well have been a feast. Jonas didn't speak much. He never did. But now and again, she caught the way his gaze lingered on the dark beyond the firelight, his eyes sharp and distant, like a man always measuring the weight of a coming storm. Clara asked him then, beneath that endless stretch of stars, "Who are you, really?" The old man didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tarnished locket, rubbing his thumb over it before tucking it away again. "Used to be a lawman," he said finally. "Long time back. Name don't matter now." Clara leaned closer to the warmth of the fire, feeling the ache in her body settle into a heavy, persistent throb. "What happened?" Jonas's jaw tightened, the flicker of firelight catching on the old, faded scars along his cheek. "Outlaws happened. Men like Macklin. Different names. Same kind of poison. Took my wife. My boy. Burned my home while I was out chasing another bastard." Clara's chest tightened, grief for a man she hardly knew settling beside her own. She wanted to say something, but the desert didn't leave much room for easy words. "I hunted him," Jonas went on, his voice quiet, stripped raw. "All of them. One by one. Took me 3 years. By the end, there wasn't much of me left worth savant." The wind picked up, carrying the mournful cry of a coyote somewhere beyond the canyon's edge. Clara shivered. "You saved me," she said softly. Jonas looked at her then, and for the first time she saw it. Not just the weight of old violence, but the dim, flickering ember of something stubborn and human. At dawn, they moved again. Clara's strength faded faster with each hour. The child inside her kicked now, restless, as though sensing the danger in every heartbeat. Blood painted the inside of her thighs by midday, and she knew, without needing to ask, that it was time. Jonas found a narrow cut between 2 high walls of stone, a place half hidden by thorn bush and leaning rock. Nestled there was a shack, old and battered, but standing. A single room, built by desperate hands long ago, forgotten by men, but not by the land. He cleared the doorway, checked the shadows, then helped her inside. "I built this place," Jonas muttered, setting his rifle by the door. "Back when I thought I could disappear from the world." Clara sagged onto the crude cot against the wall. Pain rolled through her in waves now, stealing her breath. She gritted her teeth and pressed a hand to her belly. "It's coming," she gasped. Jonas moved fast. He brought water from a nearby spring, built a fire, and tore strips of clean cloth from an old shirt. His rough hands, so steady on a rifle, turned unexpectedly gentle. Through the long, blood-soaked hours of labor, he stayed by her, speaking little, but never leaving. When the child finally came, it was small and silent for a terrible moment before its thin cry split the air. "A girl," Jonas murmured, wrapping the squalling infant in cloth. He handed her to Clara, who cradled the tiny bundle against her chest, tears streaking down her dust-caked face. "She's alive," Clara whispered, half in disbelief. Jonas nodded, leaning back against the wall, his face unreadable in the dim firelight. Outside, the night had fallen hard and fast, and the cries of coyotes rose closer. "We can't stay long," Jonas said quietly. "They'll be hunting us." And they were. Out in the desert, Macklin Crow and his men cut a cruel path through rock and scrub. Their torches flickered like distant fireflies against the black sky. Tracks led them through ravines and over rises. Blood called to blood, and Macklin wasn't a man to leave a slight unanswered. Jonas could feel them closing in, like wolves on the scent. He reinforced the shack's door, loaded his rifle, and set traps along the narrow trail leading into the canyon. Clara, weak but alive, watched him work. "Why risk it for me?" she asked. Jonas paused, adjusting a snare loop around a sharp length of stone. He glanced at the child in her arms, then at Clara. "Didn't risk it for you," he said. "Risked it for her." In the dying firelight, his scars softened, and Clara saw not a killer, but a man chasing something he'd lost and maybe found again in the fragile life cradled in her arms. They hunkered down as the night stretched on. Every sound in the darkness a possible footfall, every gust of wind a whisper of coming death. Jonas Cutter, once known across 3 states as the Vulture for the way he circled men before striking, sat with his rifle across his lap, his eyes cold and waiting. He knew this wasn't over. The past never stayed buried long in places like Dry Creek, and men like Macklin Crow always came back to finish what they started. But for now, there was the child's steady breathing, Clara's defiant grip on life, and the rough, honest warmth of an old shack standing alone in a land that remembered every sin. And Jonas Cutter, the last man standing between the living and the dead. The night came down like a lid over the Badlands, pressing heat and silence into every hollow and rise. Far off, the first streaks of dawn bled along the horizon, casting the jagged spires of Crow's Ridge into cruel, red-edged silhouettes. The canyon wall stood high and narrow there, a dead-end maze of stone and shadow where even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. Jonas Cutter moved through the dark with the easy grace of a man who knew how death traveled. His face was stone, his eyes cold, and the long rifle in his hands an extension of muscle and thought. The traps were set, snare loops strung between rocks, lengths of sharpened wood buried beneath sand, and tripwires rigged to send stonefall crashing down. Every hollow had been marked in his mind, every narrow pass catalogued for the work to come. Clara lay in the small shack, the child swaddled at her side. She could feel the storm gathering out there beyond the fire's reach, could hear the faint scrape of boots on stone, the distant clink of spurs. Her heart pounded in her throat, not from fear, but from a sharp, defiant clarity. She'd come too far to bow now. Jonas returned to the doorway, crouched low. His face, half lit by firelight, looked older than the mountains behind him. "They're close," he murmured. "When it starts, you keep low. Use that rifle like I showed you." She nodded, clutching the weapon to her chest. It felt heavy, but not wrong in her hands. "Don't hesitate, girl," Jonas said softly. "Hesitatin' gets you dead." Out in the dark, Macklin's men crept forward, torches left behind to keep the canyon's cover. There were 7 of them, spread along the narrow ridges and gullies, their faces drawn tight, with blood hunger and the need to erase the humiliation of their failed hunt. Macklin himself moved like a predator, his pale hair catching the faintest hint of light. They didn't see the first trap until it was too late. A low branch snapped under a boot heel, releasing a deadfall of jagged stones. 2 men dropped instantly, skulls shattered, their cries cut off by the wet thud of rock against flesh. The others spun, weapons raised, shouts echoing off the stone. Jonas's rifle cracked once, the muzzle flare splitting the dark. Another man pitched forward, his chest blown open. Panic turned their formation ragged. They fired wild into the night, the muzzle flashes blooming like brief, savage flowers. Clara crouched behind the doorframe, every nerve raw. She saw Jonas move, not like the weary old man she'd met, but with the lethal certainty of a predator. His knife flashed, catching the throat of a man who blundered too close. The outlaw fell without a sound. They tried to pull back, but the canyon turned against them. One stumbled into a snare, the wire cinching tight around his ankle and hauling him upward. His scream was cut short by a second bullet. Macklin swore, eyes narrowing. "It's him," he hissed. "It's the Vulture." The name rippled through his remaining men like a curse. "You said he was dead," one of them stammered. "He will be," Macklin spat. At the shack, Clara saw the pale glimmer of a figure approaching, rifle leveled, her pulse hammered, her palms slick against the stock of her weapon. She remembered Jonas's words. No hesitation. She squeezed the trigger. The shot kicked her shoulder back, but she saw the man drop, saw the shock on his face as he died. A sick, savage thrill rose in her chest. Not joy, not grief. Something sharper. A refusal to be taken. Jonas was already moving again, stalking through the narrow channels of stone. Blood marked his path, but none of it his own. The last of Macklin's men turned and ran, but one slipped on loose shale and fell hard. Jonas was there before the man could rise. The outlaw stared up, his mouth working soundlessly. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Cutter," he gasped. "Sweet God, it's really you." Jonas didn't answer. The knife flashed once, and the man lay still. Now it was just Macklin. The outlaw stood alone near the ridge's edge, pale hair tangled, his face drawn into a mask of fury and disbelief. He raised his gun, but the bullet went wide. Jonas dropped his rifle, stepped forward, and drew the long knife from his belt. No more running, Macklin. They came together hard, the fight savage and close. Blade scraped bone, fists cracked against flesh. Blood splashed the stone. Macklin was younger, quicker, but Jonas fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Every strike was final, every movement honed by years of killing. Clara watched from the shack's doorway, the child wailing behind her, the sound high and sharp against the breaking dawn. The fight ended in a single, brutal motion, Jonas driving the knife up beneath Macklin's ribs. The outlaw's face twisted, breath catching. "Should have stayed dead," Macklin croaked. Jonas said nothing. He let Macklin fall, the man's blood pooling dark against the rock. In the canyon's stillness, a figure stepped forward, Preacher Pike, haggard and desperate, his face streaked with sweat. His hand clutched a pistol, shaking. "You think this changes anything, Cutter?" he spat. "God's law will." A shot cracked. Pike staggered, eyes wide, and fell to his knees. Clara lowered the smoking rifle. The preacher's mouth worked uselessly, blood spilling down his chin. He reached toward her, pleading. "Mercy," he whispered. She stepped closer, standing over him. The baby's cry filled the air again. "There was none for me," she said. Jonas came up beside her, his gaze meeting hers. He gave a slow, approving nod. When Pike stilled, the last echo of his fall faded into the waking world. The sun lifted fully then, casting blood-red light across the ridge. The dead lay where they'd fallen. The wind stirred, carrying away the scent of gunpowder and blood, leaving only silence. Jonas sheathed his knife and looked to Clara. She met his gaze, and in that shared look was something unspoken, understanding, grief, and something harder, something that could survive out here where so little else did. "It's done," she said. Jonas nodded. For now. The sun rose slow over Dry Creek, staining the sky with thin streaks of pale gold and copper. The town lay hushed beneath it, a place that had once roared with the fevered cries of sermons and gunfire, now sitting quiet as a graveyard. The dust hung in the air, clinging to weathered boards and broken signs, and for the first time in years, no one gathered at the church or the saloon. The street stood empty, as though the land itself waited to see what came next. Jonas Cutter rode in at the head of a battered horse, his coat torn and streaked with blood and dust, his rifle resting easy across his saddle. Beside him, Clara sat upright, the child swaddled against her chest, her face lined with weariness but unbowed. Behind them, the canyon winds carried the memory of men who would not return. They reached the square and found them there, the townsfolk gathered, drawn by the grim pull of reckoning. The preacher's platform still stood, the noose swaying lazily in the dawn breeze. Faces stared from doorways and windows, the brave one stepping into the street, though no one spoke. Jonas dismounted, his boots hitting the earth with a soft, final thud. He reached into his saddlebag and drew out two things. One was a worn leather-bound Bible, its spine cracked and streaked with dark stains. The other was Macklin Crow's badge, its metal dulled with blood and dust. He tossed them both into the dirt at the center of the square. "Preacher Pike's sins," Jonas said, his voice carrying clear in the morning stillness. written in his own hand. Every name he blackmailed, every coin he took to look the other way, while Crow bled this town dry. Every soul he damned for the sake of his own seat. A ripple passed through the crowd. Men shifted, eyes flicking to one another. A woman's hand came up to cover her mouth. And there, Jonas went on, pointing to the badge. What's left of your monster? Macklin Crow. He won't be coming back. The silence deepened, thick and suffocating. No one moved. Jonas's gaze swept them, scarred and cold and sharp as ever. You let this happen, he said, quiet now. And somehow that was worse. All of you. Turned your backs. Cast out a girl who did you no harm. Listened while a snake in a preacher's coat told you God wanted blood. Watched while men like Crow ruled by fear and cruelty, and called it justice. A man near the front swallowed hard. Another looked down at his boots. Clara spoke then, her voice raw but steady. I'm taking back my land, she said, and I don't need your permission. No one argued. The sun crested the ridgeline then, spilling bright light across the square, catching in Jonas's silvered hair and in the soft down of the sleeping child in Clara's arms. The desert wind stirred, tugging at his coat. Jonas looked at Clara once, a flicker of something almost like a smile ghosting across his worn face. You'll be fine now, he murmured. She nodded, words thick in her throat. Without another glance at the townsfolk, Jonas turned and mounted his horse. He rode slow through the square, the people parting like a shadow drawn back from the edge of flame. No one spoke to him. No one dared. Some would say later it was out of shame. Others, fear. At the edge of town, Jonas paused and looked back one last time. The baby stirred then, gave a sharp, clear cry that seemed to hang in the morning air like a bell's chime. Jonas tipped his hat, then nudged the horse forward. By the time the sun fully cleared the hills, the rider was gone. Nothing but a trail of dust and a name, already starting to take shape in whispered stories. A name the wind would carry to other towns, to other lawless corners of the world. The outlaw who came back. The ghost who walked with death and left salvation in his wake. Jonas Cutter. The last good man, when no one else would be.